Inside the corporate service bay at Harmon Precision Group, a ring of white coats stood in silence around a black Bentley Mulsanne. The car sat low and still under the fluorescent lights like a sleeping thing that refused to wake. A red diagnostic cart blinked errors. A second cart repeated them. The clock above the bay doors had been ticking for 6 hours. 6 hours. Guacwan stood at the edge of the bay, not packing, not speaking. He didn't need to. His stillness was louder than any demand. 2 of his men flanked him, arms crossed, eyes forward. The room felt it, the weight of a man who did not give second chances. His bespoke sedan, hand-built, one of 4 in the world, sat in the middle of this gleaming, high-budget facility and refused to start. And the 12 senior engineers surrounding it, the best Harmon's money could buy, the men with the framed certificates, the men with the firm handshakes and the corner offices, had nothing. Just clipboards. Just excuses dressed up in technical language. Director Hewitt loosened his collar for the 3rd time. He kept talking, something about proprietary software protocols and manufacturer-coded anomalies, but his voice had the texture of a man who already knew he was wrong. His deputy ran another scan. The machine beeped the same red. Someone whispered something about flying in a specialist from Stuttgart. Guacwan did not blink. Out in the back corridor, Sarah Kane heard all of it. She had been assigned to inventory that morning. Inventory. 7 years at this firm. 7 years of designing the diagnostic frameworks that these men were now misreading, and today she was counting brake fluid and signing off on socket sets. She stood at the corridor entrance with her sleeves rolled up, a work rag folded over her left hand, and she listened to Director Hewitt explain, slowly and carefully, why a car could not be fixed. She already knew what was wrong. She had known within 40 seconds of hearing the symptom description filter through the bay wall. She had written a technical paper on this exact failure cascade 3 years ago. The firm had published it under a different name. She stepped into the doorway. The room didn't notice her immediately. She was used to that. "If you permit," she said, "I will fix it." The silence broke wrong, not in awe, in amusement. A few engineers turned. One smiled with his teeth. Director Hewitt did not smile. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has appeared in the wrong place, not dangerous, just misplaced. "Kane," his voice was flat, "you're not scheduled for this bay." "The fault is a dual-source pressure bleed," she said, not to Hewitt. Her eyes were on the engine compartment. "There's a microfracture in the primary vacuum line running interference with the adaptive throttle sensor. They're masking each other. Your diagnostics are reading both as one signal. They're not." A beat of silence. "We ran 4 diagnostic cycles," Hewitt said. "I know, I built the 3rd one." No one laughed this time. Guacwan turned his head, not much, just enough to look at her properly for the first time. He studied her the way a man studies something he has not yet categorized. Sharp gaze, no expression. Then he looked at Hewitt, then back at her. "Her," he said, one word, quiet as stone dropping into still water. Hewitt opened his mouth. "Mr. Guac, she is not a senior." "Her," Guacwan did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room shifted. 2 engineers stepped back without being asked. Someone, almost reflexively, held out a pair of gloves. Sarah looked at the gloves. She looked at the car. She breathed once, slowly, through her nose. Then she took the gloves, pulled them on, and walked to the engine bay. Her hands did not shake. They never did when she was near an engine. This was the only place in her life where nothing was political. Metal didn't care about your roots. A fault didn't care about your title. The engine either ran or it didn't, and only the truth could make it run. She moved without performance. No announcement, no theater. She pulled a compact scope from her coat pocket and crouched by the vacuum assembly line. She traced the harness with 2 fingers, not pressing, listening, the way a doctor presses a stethoscope and hears what the body is trying to hide. She found it in under a minute. A hairline fracture, almost cosmetic, almost invisible, sitting at a junction point that the diagnostic software hadn't been calibrated to isolate because the sensor beside it was throwing a louder, false reading. "There," she said softly. Then she traced the secondary fault, the throttle sensor ground wire, barely missing it in its bracket, vibrating under load, sending corrupted data upstream. And there. Fix one without the other and the car still won't run. Both problems protect each other. Director Hewitt made a sound. Not words, just a sound. She reached for a micro-wrench, reset the line clamp, reseated the sensor wire, wrapped it clean, secured it away from the vibration point. She checked her work. Checked it again. Then she checked it a third time, not because she doubted herself, but because she respected the machine. She always had. She stood, peeled off the gloves, set them down neatly on the cart. Done, she said. 17 minutes. The bay was very quiet. Someone coughed. Someone didn't. Director Hewitt stood with his clipboard at his side, not writing anything down. Guacwan walked toward the car slowly. He placed a hand on the roof, not possessively, almost gently, the way a man touches something he values. He looked at Sarah. His sharp gaze held hers for a long moment, and in it was something that nobody in this building had ever given her before. Not congratulations, not surprise. Recognition. Start it, he said to his man. The key turned. The Bentley's engine caught immediately, smooth and low and perfect, like it had never been anything else. The sound moved through the bay like a verdict. Guacwan did not look at Hewitt. He kept his eyes on Sarah. Your name, he said. She held his gaze. Sarah Kane. He nodded once, slow, final, like a decision already made. Miss Kane, his voice was still quiet, still calm. I would like to speak with you outside. Director Hewitt stepped forward. Mr. Guac, company protocol requires that any client communication go through senior. Guacwan walked past him as if he had not spoken. His two men followed. He paused at the bay door and looked back at Sarah, not at anyone else. And Sarah Kane picked up her work rag, folded it once, set it on the cart beside the gloves, and followed him. She did not look at Hewitt. She had spent 7 years looking at men like Hewitt, waiting for them to see what was right in front of them. She was done waiting. Outside, the afternoon light was pale and cool against the corporate glass. Guacwan stopped. His men held a respectful distance. He turned to face her, and she met his gaze with the same steadiness she had brought to the engine, no performance, no apology. You knew immediately, he said. Yes. And you said nothing until now. She let that sit for a second. I wasn't permitted to say anything until now. Something moved in his eyes, not sympathy, something sharper. I have a facility, he said. 17 vehicles, 3 aircraft, a problem that has cost me 2 contracts and 6 weeks. He paused. I don't need a department. I need someone who knows what they are looking at. Sarah looked at him. Mafia boss. Feared name. The kind of man her old HR handbook had a whole section about. And he was the first person in 7 years to look at what she could do and ask for more of it. She didn't answer him yet, but she didn't look away either. Because in her mind, a door was opening, and this time she hadn't knocked. Before we go further, drop in the comments right now, where are you watching this from? And if you've ever been the most qualified person in the room and still got passed over, type I'm ready below. Like this video and stay close, because what Sarah says next to Guacwan is going to change everything. The promotion board met on the 3rd Thursday of every month, in a glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor that everyone called the fishbowl. You could see in. You just couldn't hear anything. Sarah had learned early that this was deliberate. She had prepared for 11 weeks. Not casually, surgically. She had documented every project she had touched in the past 2 years, every diagnostic framework she had originated, every client escalation she had resolved before it became a formal complaint. She had printed the records, cross-referenced them against Harmon's internal performance metrics, and compiled a 14-page technical portfolio that showed, without opinion or embellishment, what she had built and what it had produced for the firm. She had stayed until midnight on a Tuesday to finish it. She had read it back to herself on Wednesday morning like a closing argument. She knew what she was worth. She had the receipts. Director Hewitt had asked her to come in at 9. The clock on the fourth floor read 9:47 when his assistant finally called her name. The fishbowl was smaller than it looked from the corridor. Hewitt sat at the center of the oval table with two other senior directors flanking him, Director Ose on his left, Director Bright on his right. Both men Sarah had briefed, assisted, and covered for across more combined projects than she cared to number. A single chair waited on the opposite side of the table. Her portfolio sat in front of her chair already. Someone had placed it there. It had not been opened. She sat. She did not fidget. She had made herself a promise that morning. Whatever happens in this room, your hands stay still. Sarah, Hewitt opened with her first name, the way people do when they want intimacy without equality. Thank you for your patience. We know this process takes time, and we want you to know the board takes every candidacy very seriously. She watched his hands. He hadn't touched her portfolio. We've reviewed your file, he continued, your project history, your peer assessments. You have, without question, some of the strongest technical scores in your division. He paused there, the way a man pauses before a but, letting the compliment do just enough work to soften what follows. The question for us at the senior engineer level isn't purely technical. It's about leadership readiness, client-facing confidence, the kind of executive presence that the role requires. Sarah kept her hands flat on the table. I led the Renault fleet retrofit, she said. Her voice was even. Start to finish. 12 vehicles, 4-week timeline, delivered 9 days early. Director Osai presented the final review to the client. Director Osai cleared his throat. You supported that project significantly, Hewitt said. I designed the diagnostic sequence. I supervised the Bay team. I wrote the client report. She did not raise her voice. The support was directional. A small silence. Director Bright shifted in his chair. He was a careful man, bright, careful the way people are careful when they sense that precision is being used against them. Sarah, no one is disputing your contribution, he said. What we're trying to articulate is something harder to quantify. There's a quality to senior leadership here that goes beyond the technical. Our clients are particular. They want someone at the table who feels, well, established. The word landed where he intended it to. Established, not experienced, not qualified, established. The kind of word that means something very specific when it is used about a black woman in a white coat in a room full of men who already consider themselves settled. Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her portfolio, still closed, still pristine, still containing 14 pages of evidence that no one in this room had read. What would established look like? She asked. Specifically, what would I need to demonstrate that I haven't already demonstrated? Hewitt folded his hands. It's less about a single demonstration and more about a sustained. The Castellan account, she said. The brake anomaly on the fleet lease vehicles last November. You brought me in at 11 at night because the lead engineers couldn't identify the source. I found a systematic calibration drift across 9 vehicles caused by a batch firmware error in the sensor array. I resolved it in 4 hours. The client never knew there was a problem. She paused. Who presented that resolution to the client the following morning? No one spoke. Director Hewitt did, she said. I have the email thread. It's on page 9. Hewitt looked at her portfolio for the first time. Sarah, his tone shifted slightly, still measured but tighter at the edges. We understand this process can feel frustrating. I'm not frustrated, she said, and she meant it in the way that is worse than frustration. She was clear. I'm asking a precise question. What does this firm need to see from me that it hasn't already seen in documented form in that portfolio? Because I've led the work. I've protected the client relationships. I've solved problems that the senior team brought to me specifically because they couldn't solve them. I need to understand what gap you're describing, because from where I'm sitting, I cannot see it. Director Bright made a small sound, not a word, a sound. Hewitt straightened. This was the moment, she could see it, where the decision had already been made and now only needed to be delivered. We've decided, he said, to go in a different direction for this cycle. And there it was, clean, final, dressed in corporate grammar so smooth you could almost slide past it without bleeding. We've decided to go in a different direction." The elevator in the corridor dinged. And for just a second, the length of a breath, Sarah was not in the fishbowl. She was in the third-floor archive room 2 years ago, sitting with a printed draft of the Castellan Diagnostic Framework. Reading her own methodology under a senior lead's name in a client presentation she had never been invited to attend. She had held that paper for a long time. She had not said anything. She had gone back to her bay and done the next job, and the job after that, and the job after that, because she had believed, she had needed to believe, that truth eventually became impossible to ignore. The elevator dinged again. She came back, white coats, oval table, 3 men who had just decided. "Understood," she said. She picked up her portfolio, stood, straightened her coat. She did not slam the door. She did not give them the dignity of a visible wound. In the corridor, she walked past the elevator without pressing the button. She took the stairs. All 4 flights down, her footsteps quiet on the concrete, her jaw set, her hands, as promised, perfectly still. Here is what nobody tells you about being overlooked for long enough. It stops feeling like injustice and starts feeling like weather. You stop expecting the sun. You dress for the cold. You become so efficient at absorbing the loss that the people delivering it stop seeing it as a loss at all. They see a woman who takes feedback well, a woman who doesn't make scenes, a woman who will come back next quarter and do the work again. Sarah had been that woman for 7 years. She was not going to be that woman for 7 more. She went to her bay. She pulled on her work gloves. She opened the diagnostic panel on a mid-service saloon and began working through a routine fault check, and she let the hum of the car tell her what the room above had refused to. Engines were honest. Engines gave you the truth in vibration and heat and sound, and if you listened carefully enough, they told you exactly where the brake was. She had been listening her whole career. The question was no longer whether she was good enough. She had settled that question years ago, quietly and completely, in the only courthouse that mattered, the work itself. The question now was what she was going to do about a system that had already decided it didn't matter. She was still thinking about that when she heard it. First, the sound, a black Bentley Mulsanne rolling through the main bay doors with the slow weight of something that knew it was significant. Then the temperature of the room changed. Not literally, but rooms have temperatures that have nothing to do with air. Every engineer in the bay straightened, almost involuntarily, the way bodies respond to the arrival of something they instinctively register as powerful. 2 men in dark suits came through first, then the car, then a 3rd man who walked the way very few people walk, like the space around him belonged to him not by claim but by fact. Tattoos at his collar, a gaze that moved across the room and categorized everything in it within seconds. Guacwan. Sarah knew the name. Everyone in the building knew the name. She kept her eyes on her diagnostic panel. She was in the middle of a fault sequence. She did not look up. But her hands, for the first time all morning, had gone very still for a different reason. Because she had heard the Mulsanne pull in, and even from 20 feet away, she had heard something underneath the idle. A texture in the engine note so slight that you would miss it completely if you weren't listening for the truth. She was always listening for the truth. Director Hewitt appeared at the bay entrance in under 3 minutes, tie straightened, posture recalibrated, the performance of senior authority assembled so fast it would have been impressive in different circumstances. He crossed the floor toward Guacwan with the handshake already forming at the end of his arm. Sarah went back to her panel. She did not think about what had happened upstairs. She thought about what she had heard in that engine, about where a fault like that would hide and why, about the sequence of events that would have to be true for 2 separate failure signals to mask each other into something that looked like a single, unresolvable problem. She ran the logic quietly, the way she always did, not as a decision, just as a habit. The habit of a woman who could not stop knowing things, even on the worst days of her career. Especially on the worst days. By the time Hewitt's team had arranged themselves around the Mulsanne with their diagnostic carts, Sarah already knew. She pressed her lips together, looked at the senior engineers gathering their equipment, looked at Guacwan standing at the edge of the bay with his arms at his sides and his patience visibly finite. She looked back at her panel. We've decided to go in a different direction. The engine of the Mulsanne sat 10 meters away, waiting for someone honest enough to hear it. Sarah Kane pulled off her gloves, folded them, set them on the cart. And she waited. Because here is the thing about a woman who has been told not yet for 7 years straight. She doesn't need permission to know the answer. She only needs one moment when the cost of staying silent finally outweighs the cost of speaking. That moment was coming. The Mulsanne had been in the bay for 40 minutes before anyone admitted they didn't know what they were looking at. That admission didn't come as a statement. It came as silence. The specific, pressurized silence of men who have run out of confident things to say, but haven't yet found the courage to say nothing. Diagnostic carts blinked. Laptops refreshed. Engineers leaned over the open engine bay with the posture of study and the eyes of confusion, and the room filled with the particular noise of expertise performing itself for an audience it could not afford to disappoint. Guacwan had not moved from his position at the edge of the bay. He stood with his jacket open, hands loose at his sides, and watched. That was all. He did not pace. He did not check his phone. He did not ask questions or offer suggestions or perform any of the behaviors of a man seeking reassurance. He simply watched, with the quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned that the most useful information in any room is usually the information no one is volunteering. His associate, a younger man, composed and quiet, stood 2 steps behind him and slightly left. His 2 security detail held the bay entrance. The Mulsanne sat in the center of the floor like a fact no one could argue with, black, bespoke, and completely uncooperative. Director Hewitt stood at the car's left flank with his arms crossed, and his expression arranged into something that was meant to communicate authority, and was communicating something closer to delay. Beside him, lead engineer Rourke, silver-haired, 22 years at Harmon, the man whose name appeared on more completed work orders than anyone else in the building, though Sarah could have told you who had originated at least a third of them, crouched near the engine bay with a handheld reader and a furrowed forehead. The reader beeped. Rourke studied it. The reader beeped again. We're seeing some conflicting data across the sensor array, Hewitt said, to no one specifically and everyone generally. Completely consistent with vehicles of this specification. The on-board system is highly proprietary. We're working through a calibration variance in the reporting software. Guacwan said nothing. Hewitt's jaw moved slightly. He uncrossed and recrossed his arms. Sarah was at her station on the far side of the bay, 17 meters from the Mulsanne, running a scheduled valve clearance check on a fleet saloon that didn't need her full attention. She had been doing this for 31 minutes. The valve clearance was fine. It had been fine 20 minutes ago. She kept checking it because checking it gave her hands something to do that wasn't crossing the floor. She had heard the Mulsanne from the moment it entered. She hadn't needed to see it. The engine note had told her enough, that low, almost right idle with a texture underneath it like a word mispronounced by someone who almost knew the language. 2 faults, running simultaneously, each one making the other harder to see. She had identified the category of failure within the first 90 seconds and spent the next 29 minutes sitting quietly with the specific knowledge that no one on the other side of this bay was going to find it. Not because they weren't capable engineers, in the general sense. Rourke had good instincts. 2 of his juniors were sharp, but this fault required a very particular kind of listening, the kind that couldn't be performed on a diagnostic screen, the kind that lived in the gap between what the sensors reported and what the engine was actually saying. Sarah had been developing that kind of listening since she was 19 years old, in her uncle's repair shop in a neighborhood where nobody drove Bentleys, but engines told the same truths regardless of the badge on the hood. She knew what was wrong with that car. She pressed her lips together and checked the valve clearance again. By the 1-hour mark, the diagnostic carts had been repositioned 3 times. A second laptop had been introduced. Someone had gone to get a different calibration cable. Rourke had made 2 phone calls, one short, one shorter, and returned from both of them with the expression of a man whose outside resources had also run out of ideas. Hewitt had stopped speaking entirely, which was, in its own way, louder than anything he'd said. One of the junior engineers, a young man named Flores, who Sarah had quietly mentored through 2 complex fault diagnoses the previous year, though his reports had been submitted under Rourke's oversight, crouched near the fuel system with a pressure gauge and the careful concentration of someone who suspected he was looking in the wrong place, but didn't know which right place to look instead. He made a small mark on his clipboard. He erased it. The room had the texture of an exam where everyone has turned the paper over and found the questions are in a language they almost speak. Guacwan looked at his watch, not frantically. Once, the way a man looks at a watch when he is marking time rather than checking it. His associate leaned forward and said something quiet near his ear. Guacwan's expression didn't shift, but his gaze moved slowly, deliberately, across the assembled engineers, reading each face with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned that faces are usually more informative than words. His gaze reached the far side of the bay. It found Sarah. She was not looking at him. She was looking at an engine that had been fine for 40 minutes, but something in her posture, the contained quality of it, the stillness that was different from the strained stillness of the men around the Mulsanne, seemed to register. He watched her for a moment, then his gaze moved on. Sarah exhaled very slowly through her nose. Rourke stood up from his crouch, pressed both hands to the small of his back, and walked to Hewitt with the gait of a man carrying news he would rather not deliver. The conversation was low. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she had spent 7 years reading the body language of this particular exchange. The slight forward tilt of the man delivering bad news, the controlled stillness of the man receiving it, the micro-adjustment of posture that happens when an authority figure realizes he is about to have to say something to a client that reframes the previous hour as wasted. Hewitt nodded. Rourke returned to the car. Hewitt straightened, tugged his lapels, and walked toward Guacwan with the composed expression of a man delivering a speech he had not had enough time to write. "Mr. Guac," his voice was measured, professional. "What we're encountering is an unusual diagnostic presentation. The vehicle's onboard system is factory sealed at a level that requires manufacturer-specific override protocols. We've reached out to our contacts at the Mark's technical division, and we're expecting." "How long?" Guacwan's voice was quiet. It was always quiet, Sarah would later understand. The quieter it got, the more load it carried. Hewitt hesitated for less than a second. "We'd want to be conservative in our estimate." "How long?" 24 hours, possibly 36, depending on the manufacturer's response time. The bay was very still. Guacwan looked at Hewitt for a moment that stretched beyond comfort. Then he looked at the car. Then he looked at his associate, who gave a small, barely visible shake of his head, a shared language of 2 men who had been in enough rooms to know when a room had already failed them. 6 hours, Guacwan said. "Your team has had 6 hours. The vehicle presents a highly complex." 6 hours. He said it again, not as a correction, as a record, a mark being made. He turned away from Hewitt, not dramatically. He simply redirected his attention the way you redirect attention from something that has stopped being useful. He looked at the car. He looked at the clock above the bay doors. He looked at the ring of white-coated engineers who were all, in various configurations of posture and expression, avoiding looking directly at him. And then his gaze moved again, back across the bay, back to the far station, back to the woman who was not looking at him and had not looked at the Mulsanne and had not shifted from her position in 40-something minutes, and was somehow, in all of that studied stillness, the most alert person in the room. He watched her for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at his associate and said something in Korean, low and brief. His associate glanced toward Sarah's station, looked back at Guacwan, gave a small nod. This is the thing about a room full of people pretending to know something. Eventually, the pretending costs more energy than the knowing. You can feel it happen. The air changes. The sounds change. The confident tap of keyboards becomes slower. The murmured technical consultations become shorter. And underneath all of it, if you are paying the right kind of attention, you can hear the moment when the performance stops being sustainable. Sarah had been paying that kind of attention for 47 minutes. She set down her calibration tool. She stood. She did not look at Hewitt. She did not look at Rourke. She looked at the Mulsanne, at the open engine bay, at the nest of misread sensors and misunderstood signals that 12 credentialed engineers had spent the better part of a working day failing to untangle, and she felt something she had been keeping carefully contained since 9:47 that morning begin to move in her chest. Not anger, sharper than anger, cleaner. Certainty. She picked up her work rag, folded it once, and began walking across the bay. She had covered maybe 6 meters when Rourke saw her. His expression shifted, not alarm exactly. Confusion first, then something harder. Kane, his voice was low, a warning wrapped in a name. She kept walking. Kane, louder this time, several heads turned. Hewitt looked up from his conversation with his deputy and found her mid-bay, moving with the quiet, direct momentum of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply executing it. His expression did something complicated in about half a second. Surprise first, then recognition, then a fast-moving calculation about what this was going to look like if he didn't stop it. Sarah, his voice had the crisp edge he used when he needed compliance quickly. This is not your assignment. Return to your station. She stopped. Not because he had told her to. She stopped because she had reached the edge of the Mulsanne's orbit, close enough now to hear the engine clearly, close enough to feel the specific wrongness of it in the way she had been feeling it from across the room for the past 47 minutes, translated now from impression into certainty. She looked at the engine. Then she looked up past Rourke, past Hewitt's deputy, past the ring of white coats, and she looked directly at Guacwan. He was already looking at her. His expression gave nothing, but he had not looked away, and he did not look away now. He simply watched, with that same quality of attention he had given everything else in this room, except this time it was different. This time the attention wasn't the attention of a man waiting for something to happen. It was the attention of a man who thought something already had. Sarah held his gaze for one breath. Then she said it. If you permit, her voice was level, calm, carrying across the bay without effort the way a true statement carries. I will fix it. The room stopped. Hewitt's breath audibly shifted. Rourke's hand tightened on his clipboard. Somewhere behind her, one of the junior engineers made a sound that might have been disbelief and might have been something else entirely. Guacwan did not move, did not blink, did not perform any of the reactions the room was performing around him. He just looked at her, and the bay waited. Because every 7 years, if a woman is patient enough, if she is disciplined enough, if she is willing to keep knowing the right thing in rooms that refuse to hear it, the moment arrives. Not announced, not gift-wrapped. It arrives as a car that doesn't run and a room full of men who can't fix it and one question, hanging in the air like a held breath. Will she be permitted? The silence after those 6 words had a physical quality. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a room holding its breath because something has entered it that no one knows how to categorize yet. 12 engineers, 2 security personnel, a senior director, a lead with 22 years and a clipboard, all of them suspended in the half-second between the thing being said and the thing being processed. Hewitt recovered first. He always recovered first. It was, perhaps, his most consistent skill. Kane, the word came out flat and final, the verbal equivalent of a door closing. He took 2 steps toward her, positioning himself in the space between Sarah and the car with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 2 decades occupying the center of rooms. Step back, please. Now is not the time. The fault is dual-sourced, she said, not to Hewitt, past him. Your team has been reading a compound signal as a single fault. That's why nothing they've tried has resolved it. Rourke's head came up sharply. I said step back. Hewitt's voice dropped half a register, the register he used for performance reviews, for quarterly corrections, for the particular brand of authority that worked best when no one else was watching. You are interrupting an active client engagement. This is a serious breach of. Mr. Guac, She said the name clearly, without heat, without apology. A statement of direction, not a challenge. "I've been listening to your engine since you pulled in. I know what's wrong with it. I can fix it in under 20 minutes. The room pressure changed again. Because she had done the thing that the unwritten architecture of this building was specifically designed to prevent. She had spoken directly to the client. Over Hewitt's head. Over Rourke's head. Over 7 years of being rooted through proper channels and proper hierarchies and proper patience, she had crossed the floor and used her own voice for the first time without asking anyone's permission to do it. Hewitt turned from her to Guacwan with the expression of a man performing damage control in real time. "Mr. Guac, I apologize for this interruption. Ms. Kane is a junior technician. She's not assigned to your vehicle, and she's not authorized to speak to clients directly. I assure you, my senior team has the situation well in hand and we're close to." "Junior technician." Guacwan said it quietly, not as a question. As a repetition, the kind a precise man makes when he wants to confirm he has heard something correctly before deciding what to do with it. His eyes moved from Hewitt to Sarah. They stayed there. "She is junior," Guacwan said, "but your senior team has had 6 hours. Hewitt's mouth opened. Nothing came out that was useful. Guacwan looked at his security detail. "Step aside," he said. One of the guards, who had drifted 2 steps towards Sarah during the exchange, not aggressively, but with the quiet readiness of men accustomed to removing complications, stopped. Stepped back. Reclassified her, in a single gesture from their employer, from interruption to person of interest. Rourke made a sound. A compressed, private sound, the kind that escapes when something has gone wrong that you haven't yet figured out how to correct. He looked at Hewitt. Hewitt's jaw was set. Guacwan looked at Sarah and said nothing more. He didn't need to. The cleared space between her and the car was the sentence. The instruction was geometric. Sarah walked to the engine bay. She did not rush. This was important, not as performance, not as effect, but as necessity. Rushed hands make assumptions. Rushed hands skip the step that matters. She had learned this at 19 in her uncle's shop, when she had gone fast once on a fuel system and spent 4 hours correcting the confident mistake that speed had produced. She had not rushed since. She stopped at the engine bay and looked at it the way she always looked at an engine first, as a complete system, not a list of components. Taking the whole picture before narrowing to the specific. Reading the room before reading the fault. The Mulsanne's engine was immaculate in the way that bespoke things are immaculate, not the cleanliness of a maintained vehicle, but the cleanliness of something built by hands that knew they were building something permanent. She noted the sensor harness routing. She noted the vacuum assembly. She noted the specific position of the adaptive throttle control module and felt, in the way that was almost physical, the logic of the fault click into full resolution in her mind. There and there. She reached into her coat and removed a compact scope. Her own, carried always, the one item she had never left in her locker, and crouched beside the engine without announcing what she was doing or why. "What is she looking for?" one of the junior engineers asked. He was speaking to Rourke. He was not speaking quietly enough. "The same things we looked for," Rourke said. His voice had a tightness in it that was trying to sound like confidence and wasn't quite reaching. Sarah said nothing. She moved the scope along the vacuum assembly line with 2 fingers, not pressing, tracing the way you read something written very small. She found the fracture in 11 seconds. Hairline. Sitting at a junction point designed to be structurally redundant, which meant it had been overlooked by every automated check because the system was built to trust that junction. You couldn't fault the diagnostic software for missing it. The software didn't know to distrust the thing it had been told was safe. Sarah knew to distrust it because she had written a technical paper 3 years ago about exactly this category of failure in high-specification vacuum assemblies. The paper had been published under a different name. She had the original draft saved in 3 places. She moved to the throttle control module, found the sensor wire, barely misseated in its bracket, the insulation stressed at a contact point so small it was functionally invisible unless you were looking at it from precisely the right angle with precisely the right light. She angled the scope. There it was. The vacuum line has a microfracture at the redundant junction on the secondary assembly, she said, not loudly, clearly. It's producing an intermittent pressure differential that the sensors are reading as a primary fuel system fault. The throttle sensor wire is simultaneously misseated, stressed insulation at the bracket contact point. Under load, it sends a corrupted signal upstream. The engine management system sees both signals and can't reconcile them. So it produces a fault presentation that looks like one large problem when it's actually two small ones canceling each other's visibility. She heard someone exhale. She did not look up to see whose breath it was. Fix one without the other, she continued, still looking at the engine, and the second fault immediately becomes the primary reading. Your diagnostics would show improvement and then rapid regression, which would appear to confirm a deeper systemic fault. It would send your team looking in completely the wrong direction for however long it took to recognize the pattern. A silence. Then Rourke said, quietly and with no remaining hostility in it, just the flat honesty of a man confronting something he cannot argue with. That's exactly what happened. Hewitt said nothing. She asked for tools only once, and she asked with precision, not a general request, a specific list. A micro-torque wrench set to a specific value, a wire sleeve of a specific gauge, a small trim tool. She said the numbers without checking anything. She knew them the way she knew her own date of birth. Someone brought them. She didn't register who. She went to work. There is a quality to watching someone operate at genuine mastery that is different from watching someone operate at high competence. Competence is visible. You can see the skill, track the logic, follow the steps. Mastery is different. Mastery has a quality of inevitability, as if the hands already know the outcome and are simply moving through the sequence to confirm what is already true. It doesn't look effortful. It doesn't look casual. It looks, if you are watching carefully, like the work and the person have stopped being two separate things. Sarah's hands moved through the engine with that quality. She loosened the vacuum line clamp with 4 precise turns, lifted the line clear, examined the fracture point, reseated the line into the correct groove configuration, and reclipped it to a clean, audible click. She did not hurry the click. She waited for it. The click was confirmation, not assumption. She moved to the sensor wire, trimmed the stressed insulation point cleanly, fitted the wire sleeve, rerouted the wire away from the bracket contact with a tie-off that would hold under repeated thermal cycling. She pressed the wire harness gently back into the correct seating geometry and held it for a moment, feeling with her fingertips whether the seating had true tension or tension that only felt true. It had true tension. She cleaned the work area. Checked the vacuum line junction again, second check, different angle. Checked the sensor wire routing, third check, hands only, no tools. Just the sensitivity of fingers that had been trained to know the difference between secure and almost secure. She stood. She pulled off her gloves and held them at her side. Done, she said. The clock above the bay doors read 17 minutes since she had walked to the car. Nobody spoke immediately. It was Flores, young, careful Flores, who she had quietly walked through 2 fault diagnoses and who had submitted both under someone else's name, who broke the silence. He said nothing. He simply looked at the engine, then at Sarah, then at the engine again, with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that keeps producing the same answer. Rourke crossed to the engine bay. He looked at the vacuum line junction. He looked at the sensor wire routing. He looked for a long time. Then he straightened and did not speak, but something in his face had changed, the tightness gone, replaced by something more complicated and less comfortable. The expression of a man recognizing something he has been miscategorizing for a long time. Hewitt had not moved from his position near the diagnostic cart. He stood with his arms at his sides and his clipboard against his leg, and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who is trying to not look like he is losing something. He was not succeeding. Guacwan walked to the engine bay. He did not look at the engine the way the engineers had been looking at it, with instruments, with software, with the performed vocabulary of technical authority. He looked at it the way he had looked at everything else today, directly, without mediation, reading what was actually there rather than what he had been told to see. He stood beside Sarah, a foot of distance between them. He looked at the junction, at the wire, at the clean geometry of the work. Then he looked at her. She met his gaze with the same steadiness she had brought to the engine. No performance, no appeal, just the clear, level look of a woman who has just done an honest thing and does not need anyone to confirm it was honest, because the truth of it is sitting right there in front of everyone in the room. "Who are you?" he said. "Not what is your title, not which department, not who authorized you. Who are you?" She held his gaze. "Sarah Kane." He nodded, slow, the nod of a man filing something carefully. He turned to his associate and said 3 words in Korean. His associate took out a phone. Then Guacwan looked at Hewitt for the first time in several minutes, looked at him with the specific quality of attention you give something you have fully assessed and fully discounted, and said, to no one in particular and therefore to everyone, "Start it." The key turned. The Mulsanne's engine caught clean and deep and perfect, the way an engine sounds when it has been told the truth about itself. The sound moved through the bay like water finding its level, settling every surface it touched, clarifying every space it entered. No one spoke over it. In the quiet underneath the engine's resolution, Hewitt's clipboard found its way to the diagnostic cart. He set it down without sound. He did not pick it up again. Guacwan listened to his car run for exactly 5 seconds. Then he turned from the car and looked at Sarah Kane and said, in the same quiet voice he used for everything that mattered, "Walk with me." Because there are moments in a career, in a life, when the room you have been working in stops being the room you are meant to stay in. When the evidence has accumulated beyond argument and the only thing left is the decision. Do you walk through the door, or do you wait for someone to officially open it? Sarah had been waiting for 7 years. The door was open. Sarah picked up her gloves, looked at the engine one final time, running clean, running true, telling no more lies because it no longer had anything to hide. Then she looked at Guacwan and gave a single nod. She walked. Behind her, she heard Hewitt draw breath to speak again. She did not slow down to hear what he said. Because here is what 17 minutes can do that 6 hours cannot. It can make the truth undeniable, not comfortable, not convenient, not welcomed by everyone in the room who needed it to be otherwise, but undeniable, and denial, once it becomes impossible, has nowhere left to go except into the silence of people confronting the distance between what they believed and what is actually true. 12 engineers stood in that silence. One walked out of it. The corporate courtyard behind Harmon Precision Group was not designed for conversations like this one. It was designed for the specific aesthetic of institutional confidence, clean lines, trimmed hedges, a water feature that produced the sound of calm without the substance of it. A place where clients were walked after tour, where senior directors took calls they didn't want overheard through glass walls, where the architecture of the building made a quiet argument about the quality of everything happening inside it. Guacwan stood at the center of it with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at none of it. He looked at Sarah. His associate had positioned himself at the courtyard entrance, not blocking it, simply occupying it. The 2 security detail had remained inside. Out here, it was the 3 of them, and the water feature, and the particular quality of afternoon light that makes everything look more final than it probably is. Sarah stood with her work gloves folded in her left hand and waited. She had learned, across 7 years of meetings with men who held more institutional power than she did, that the person who speaks first in a silence is usually the person who is more uncomfortable with it. She was not uncomfortable. She had spent 7 years being invisible in rooms. Silence was familiar territory. Guacwan studied her for a moment longer. Then he spoke. "I run a private operation," he said. 17 ground vehicles, 3 aircraft, a maintenance facility that currently employs 9 technicians, none of whom identified a fault today that you identified in under a minute from across a room. He paused. Not for effect. Guacwan did not appear to do things for effect. He paused because he was a man who did not use more words than the situation required and was taking the time to establish the precise number. I need a technical director. Someone who runs the operation, manages the team, owns every mechanical decision. Full authority, no committee. Sarah said nothing. The compensation, he began. I have a non-compete clause, she said. He stopped. Harmon's standard senior contract, 18-month restriction, covers any automotive technical role within the region, including private fleet operations. She held his gaze. If I walk out of that building today in any professional capacity connected to your organization, their legal team will file within the week. They won't win, ultimately, but they will freeze me for long enough to make the appointment unworkable. Guacwan was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this before today. I've thought about leaving before today, she said. I hadn't thought about leaving for this. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite respect, something that occupied the space between them where both of those things lived without being either. The clause, he said, what dissolves it? A signed release from the chief executive, voluntary and unconditional. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Harmon's CEO does not give voluntary releases. It's not company policy. In 7 years, I've seen one issued for a senior director who negotiated it over 4 months with 3 rounds of legal review. Guacwan looked at her steadily. I am not a legal review. No, she said, you're not. A beat of silence. Give me the name, he said. She gave him the name. She gave it the way she gave fault diagnoses, clearly, without embellishment, without the performance of reluctance. His associate produced a phone, made a call in Korean that lasted 40 seconds, and returned the phone to his jacket. Guacwan had not looked away from Sarah during the call. 2 hours, he said. The release will be signed within 2 hours. After that, we discuss the terms of your appointment. Sarah looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at an engine before committing to a diagnosis, reading what was there rather than what she had been told to expect. Guacwan was a man of significant and specific danger. She was not naive about the shape of his organization, the nature of his income, the category of men who worked for him, and the category of work those men did. She had known his name before today the way people in this industry knew his name, as a byword for a particular variety of consequence. She was also standing in a courtyard with him because 12 credentialed engineers had failed to do what she had done in 17 minutes, and he was the first person with the power to act on that fact who had simply acted on it. No committee, no review cycle, no careful institutional language about readiness and presence, and the particular texture of leadership that happened to always look like the men who were already in the room. He had watched her work and made a decision. It was the most straightforward professional interaction she had experienced in 7 years. She was not naive about what that meant either. I need to go back inside, she said. He nodded once, understood it completely, which told her something about him, that he recognized the difference between a woman composing her exit and a woman having second thoughts, and he respected the first without mistaking it for the second. She walked back through the courtyard door. The bay had rearranged itself in her absence. Not physically, the cars were where they were, the carts where they had been left, the Mulsanne still running its quiet, resolved note in the center of the floor. But the human geometry of the room had shifted. The cluster of white coats had loosened. Flores had moved to a workstation and appeared to be documenting something with the focused attention of a person capturing a lesson before it fades. 2 of the junior engineers had drifted to adjacent tasks, the universal behavior of people who need to look busy while they process something that has made their previous busyness feel inadequate. Rourke was at the Mulsanne's engine bay, still looking at the work. He had been looking at it, she calculated, for most of the time she had been outside. Hewitt was at his office door, 20 meters away, watching the bay through the interior window. He saw her come in. His expression did not change, but his posture did, the subtle straightening of a man who has decided that the next interaction will be conducted on his terms, that the ground can be recovered, that the institutional authority he represents is more durable than one anomalous afternoon. He was wrong about that, but she understood why he believed it. She went to her station first. This was important to her, not symbolically, practically. She had tools at her station, personal equipment, the compact scope, a calibration journal she had maintained for 4 years, handwritten, containing 7 years of diagnostic observations and methodology notes that represented the accumulated record of her actual work. She had always meant to digitize it. She was glad now that she hadn't. Digital records lived on company servers. This one lived in her hands. She gathered her things with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. Scope in her coat pocket, journal in her bag, the small collection of personal tools, her own, purchased with her own money, marked with a small piece of red tape on each handle, into the worn canvas roll she had carried since her uncle's shop. She was rolling the canvas closed when Hewitt arrived at her station. He came without the clipboard. She noticed this. Hewitt without his clipboard was a man who had decided that what he needed to say did not benefit from the appearance of documentation. "Sarah," he kept his voice low. The bay had ears and he knew it. "I need you to understand the position you've put yourself in today." She pulled the canvas roll's tie and knotted it, said nothing. Speaking directly to a client without authorization is a terminable offense under Section 12 of your contract. I have not made that determination yet because I believe in giving people the opportunity to. "Are you terminating me?" she said, not aggressively, as a precision question. He paused. "I'm saying that the conversation you had with Mr. Guac, without a senior representative present, creates a serious." "Are you terminating me?" she said again. His jaw moved. "Not at this moment. What I'm saying is that going forward, any contact with this client needs to go through." "Then I'll save you the paperwork," she said. She picked up her bag, picked up the canvas roll, looked at her station one final time. The clean surface, the organized tool rack, the diagnostic terminal she had used to run analyses that had been submitted under other people's names on more occasions than she had ever formally documented. Though she had documented them, in the journal now in her bag, date and fault and resolution, and the name of the person who had presented the work to the client. 7 years of that station. 7 years of being the answer that got delivered in someone else's voice. She looked at Hewitt. The Castellan brake anomaly, the Renault fleet retrofit, the Hargrove transmission fault last March that you told the client was identified by the senior diagnostic team. She said them evenly, without heat, the way she had been wanting to say them for a long time, and had kept carefully filed until the moment when saying them would serve a purpose rather than merely a feeling. All of those are in my diagnostic journal. Date, fault, resolution, final report author. If Harmon's legal team wants to test the non-compete clause in a tribunal, that journal becomes discovery. Hewitt's color changed slightly, not dramatically, enough. "I'm not interested in a tribunal," she said. "I'm also not interested in being managed through a clause that would take 2 months and considerable legal expense to enforce against a woman who has just publicly demonstrated, in front of your most significant client, that she is the most capable engineer in this building." She held his gaze. "Get the CEO on the phone. Tell him to sign a voluntary release of my non-compete clause. Today." Hewitt stared at her. "Mr. Guac is making the same request through his own channels simultaneously," she said. "I imagine his version of the request sounds different from mine." She watched him understand what that meant, the specific arithmetic of a dangerous man making a request, and a woman making the same request, and a CEO who needed to calculate very quickly which refusal was more costly. Hewitt said nothing for a long moment. The bay was very quiet behind him. Then he turned and walked to his office, and she heard him pick up his desk phone, and she heard him ask to be connected to the executive floor. She waited 40 minutes. She spent them at a decommissioned workbench near the bay's side entrance, her bag at her feet, her canvas roll across her knees, reading nothing and thinking about everything with the calm, methodical quality she brought to fault diagnosis. What she was moving toward, what it would demand, what she was not yet certain about and needed to become certain about before she committed to it. She was not afraid. Fear required uncertainty about whether you were capable of surviving the thing ahead, and she had resolved that question a long time ago in a different room. What she felt instead was the particular alertness of a person standing at the boundary of one version of their life and another, registering both clearly before stepping across. Flores came to the workbench at the 20-minute mark. He stood at a respectful distance with the expression of someone who has something to say and isn't sure of his right to say it. "The gauge selection," he said finally. "For the wire sleeve. How did you calculate the thermal environment so fast?" She looked at him, young, careful, the kind of person who asks the real question instead of the comfortable one. "The bespoke performance modifications are documented in the vehicle registration file," she said. "They change the underhood thermal profile by 11 to 14 degrees under load. Standard spec doesn't account for that. You have to read the whole vehicle, not just the fault." He absorbed this, nodded, looked at his hands for a moment. "I submitted the Hargrove report," he said quietly. "Under Rourke's oversight, I knew the methodology was yours." She looked at him steadily. "I know." "I'm sorry." She held his gaze for a moment, long enough to let the apology land without letting it become a scene. "Learn the gauge calculation," she said. "That's worth more than the apology." His mouth straightened. He nodded again and walked back to his station with the particular gait of someone who has just been given something more demanding and more useful than forgiveness. Hewitt appeared at his office door at the 40-minute mark. He crossed the bay toward her with the walk of a man delivering a verdict that has cost him something he is still calculating. He held out a document, single page. She read it entirely before she touched it, then took it and read it again. Voluntary release. Unconditional. The CEO's signature at the bottom, ink still carrying the slight pressure of a hand that had signed in a hurry. She folded it once, put it in her bag beside the journal. She stood, picked up the canvas roll, adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Hewitt looked at her with the expression she had been seeing on his face in various configurations for 3 years. The expression of a man who knows he has been wrong about something significant and has not yet located the precise mechanism of his wrongness, which makes the knowledge worse rather than better. "For what it's worth," he said. His voice was different now. The performance had gone out of it. "It isn't," she said, not cruelly, just accurately. She walked to the bay doors, pushed them open, stepped through into the afternoon light, which was pale and clean, and landed on her face without asking what department she worked in or whether she had the seniority for it. She did not look back. Behind her, the Mulsanne's engine ran on steady, resolved, telling the truth to an empty room. Because walking out is not the dramatic part. The dramatic part is the 7 years before the walk, the accumulated weight of every morning you returned to a place that refused to see you clearly, and did the work anyway, and kept the record anyway, and stayed precise when imprecision would have been so much easier. The walk is just the mathematics of all of that finally producing its correct answer. Sarah Kane walked out of Harmon Precision Group, carrying everything she had built, and nothing she hadn't earned. What waited on the other side of that door was not a reward. It was a reckoning, with a new room, a new opposition, and a man whose organization would demand from her the same excellence she had always had, in conditions that would test it in ways a corporate bay never had. The facility existed in the kind of industrial silence that has weight. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a place that has learned to be quiet because the things happening inside it do not benefit from being heard outside it. 40,000 square feet of reinforced concrete and climate-controlled air, sitting behind a perimeter that announced nothing about what it contained. 8 vehicle bays, each one large enough to swallow a Harmon service floor hole. A separate aircraft hangar connected by a pressurized corridor. Tool inventory that made Harmon's procurement catalog look like a starter kit. Sarah had walked the facility twice on her first morning, alone, before anyone else arrived. She had done this deliberately, not to perform authority, but to understand the actual space she was inheriting before she began making decisions about it. A mechanic who doesn't know the room makes assumptions. Assumptions produce errors. She had spent a career cleaning up errors produced by men who had assumed their way through assessments they should have walked. The facility was exceptional. The operation running inside it was not. She had understood this within 72 hours. Not from what anyone told her. No one told her much of anything in those first 3 days, which was itself informative, but from what she read in the maintenance logs. 9 technicians. Combined experience that should have produced an elite team. The logs told a different story. Repeated fault recurrences on the same vehicles, diagnostic shortcuts that resolved presenting symptoms without identifying root causes, a culture of speed over accuracy that had been producing acceptable outcomes for long enough that no one had calculated the accumulating risk of the gap between acceptable and correct. The team's relationship with Sarah was established before she arrived. She had heard it in the quality of silence that greeted her first morning, not the silence of people withholding judgment, but the silence of people who had already rendered it. She was corporate. She was an outsider. She had arrived through a channel none of them had been consulted about, into a position none of them had been asked to fill, and she was a black woman in a room that had been, until 72 hours ago, entirely male and considerably less diverse than that. The opposition was not loud. It was architectural. The way a room is arranged when it is telling you that you have not been factored into its design. Ree, senior technician, 12 years with the organization, the person who had been running daily operations in the absence of a technical director, did not speak to her directly for the first 4 days unless a direct question made it unavoidable. When it was unavoidable, his answers were technically correct and entirely uninformative. Yes, no, it's been logged. The answers of a man demonstrating compliance while withholding cooperation, which is a more sophisticated form of resistance than simple refusal and considerably harder to address through procedure. The others took their register from Ree. This was the physics of established teams. The senior body sets the gravitational field and the others orbit accordingly. 2 of the younger technicians, Adisa, and a quiet, watchful man named T1 who worked with a neatness that Sarah found professionally interesting, showed occasional flickers of genuine engagement when she spoke about technical specifics. But those flickers were brief, tamped quickly back into the team's prevailing temperature, which was cold. Sarah noted all of it, adjusted nothing yet. She had learned, from years of operating in hostile rooms, that premature response to resistance produces theater, and theater produces resentment, and resentment calcifies opposition into something permanent. She was waiting for the event that would give her the right moment. The moment when the work itself created the opening that no amount of authority or credential could manufacture. She did not have to wait as long as she had expected. The call came at 11:47 on a Thursday night. Sarah was at her desk in the operations office, a glass-walled room that looked out over the vehicle bays, currently dark and still, reviewing the maintenance records for the 3rd aircraft in the syndicate's air fleet, a mid-range business jet that the logs indicated had been serviced 4 months ago, but whose bleed air system documentation contained a gap she had been unable to reconcile with the physical inspection record. The gap had been bothering her for 2 days. Her phone rang. Ree, she answered before the second ring. Bleed valve fault on the Gulf Stream. His voice was tight in the way that technical people get tight when they are managing the gap between what they know and what the situation requires them to know. Pre-flight check flagged a pressure anomaly in the bleed air system. Pilots grounded the aircraft. Mr. Guac has a departure scheduled in 4 hours. 4 hours? Who's on site? She said. She was already standing. Myself and 2 others, Adisa, Nam. I'm 12 minutes out. Don't touch the bleed valve assembly until I get there. She paused. Ree, don't touch it. A beat of silence that told her he had already been planning to touch it. Understood, he said. She was in the hangar in 11 minutes. The Gulfstream sat in the center of the aircraft bay under full lighting, access panels open at the engine pylons, the ground support equipment already connected. Ree stood at the starboard engine with a diagnostic reader and the expression of a man who had been not touching something for 11 minutes with considerable personal cost. Adisa was at the port side. Nam, the youngest of the three, 26, fast hands, and a habit of working too quickly that Sarah had noted in the vehicle bays, stood near the ground support cart looking at his phone in the specific way people look at their phones when they don't know what else to do with their hands. She went to the starboard engine first. Read the diagnostic display over Rhee's shoulder without touching it. Pressure anomaly in the bleed air system, the system that drew compressed air from the engine compressor stages and routed it to aircraft pressurization, anti-icing, and environmental control. A fault here was not a minor inconvenience. A bleed air system failure in flight, depending on its nature and location, occupied a range from serious to catastrophic. The pilot had been right to ground the aircraft. She would have done the same. She looked at the bleed valve, the component that regulated the air extraction from the compressor, looked at the surrounding assembly, looked at the ducting. Then she looked at the maintenance log entry from 4 months ago. She had photographed it from the office records on her way out the door. She looked at it on her phone now and found the gap she had been unable to reconcile, a service notation that referenced a bleed valve inspection without specifying the inspector's measurement values. Standard procedure required recorded values. These had been replaced with a single word: satisfactory. Satisfactory was not a measurement. Satisfactory was a conclusion in place of the evidence that should have supported it. She looked at Rhee, who signed the 4-month service. His jaw moved slightly. I did. She held his gaze for a moment, not accusingly, precisely. What were your bleed valve clearance measurements? A silence that told her everything. Rhee, her voice was even, I need the measurements. I don't have them recorded. I know, she put her phone away. That's why we're here at midnight. She could have delivered this as a verdict. She had the standing to deliver it as a verdict. The incomplete documentation, the recurring fault, the grounded aircraft, the 4-hour window before a departure that involved a man who did not extend second chances. She had the standing, and she had the evidence, and any reasonable definition of authority would have permitted her to use this moment to establish exactly what category of technical director she intended to be. She did not deliver it as a verdict. She set her bag down, pulled out her scope and her own measurement tools, and said, Gather here. 3 men, reluctant geometry, but they gathered. The bleed valve fault has 2 possible sources, she said, crouching at the starboard engine assembly and positioning the scope at the valve housing. First, the valve itself, worn or distorted seating preventing full closure under pressure load. Second, the ducting downstream, a restriction or partial blockage causing back pressure that reads as a valve fault at the sensor level. Diagnostic software will flag both identically because it measures pressure outcome, not pressure cause. This is why we measure the components directly, not just the system. She was not lecturing. She was working and talking while working, the way her uncle had taught her, back in the shop, on the theory that the best teaching happens when the lesson is also the answer to an actual problem. Addisa, port engine bleed valve housing. Measure the valve seat clearance. I need 3 readings, 12 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 8 o'clock positions. Call them out. Addisa moved. She heard him positioning his tool. Nam, downstream ducting, starboard side. You're looking for any restriction at the first elbow after the valve. Physical inspection, not instrument. Run your hand along the duct exterior and tell me if you feel any deformation or asymmetry. Nam put his phone away, moved to the ducting. She looked at Rhee. He was watching her, not with the studied blankness of the previous 4 days, but with something more attentive and considerably less comfortable. The expression of a man watching a process he recognizes as better than his own and working out how he feels about that recognition. Starboard valve housing, she said to him, not an order, an invitation. Same measurements as Addisa. I want both engines' values before I decide whether this is valve or duct. He hesitated for less than a second. Then he reached for his measurement tool and crouched beside her at the starboard assembly. Addisa called his readings. Port engine, 2 measurements within tolerance, 1 at the outer edge of acceptable. She noted it. Rhee worked beside her in silence. She watched his technique from her peripheral vision. It was good. she registered without comment. Precise. He had the hands of someone who had been taught correctly at some point and had been operating in an environment that didn't require the full application of what he knew. Nam called from the ducting. "There's something here." His voice had a different quality, younger, less managed. "At the first elbow, there's a deformation, like the duct was compressed. Slight, but it's there." Sarah straightened, crossed to the starboard ducting and ran her hand along the exterior to the first elbow. Found it. A subtle inward deformation, perhaps 4 millimeters at its deepest point, consistent with an impact or a compression load applied during a previous maintenance access that had not been noted because the person who applied the load had not recognized it as significant. 4 millimeters, enough to create a restriction under full bleed air load, enough to generate the back pressure the sensor was reading as a bleed valve fault. The valve itself was functioning. The duct was lying about it. She stood with her hand on the deformation and felt the specific satisfaction of a true finding, not pleasure, exactly. Resolution. The feeling of a system telling you the truth when you have asked it the right question in the right language. "The valve is not the fault," she said. "The duct is. Back pressure from a restricted elbow is reading at the valve sensor as a closure fault." She looked at the three of them, Adisa with his measurement tool still in hand, Nam crouched at the duct exterior, Ree standing 2 feet away with an expression that had finished being closed and started being something else. "We can replace the duct section or attempt a reform of the deformation in situ. Given our window, we reform in situ. It's within tolerance if we do it correctly." She looked at Ree. "Have you reformed duct deformation before?" A pause. "Once on a smaller aircraft." "The principle is identical. You'll do it. I'll measure and call the corrections." She looked at Adisa and Nam. "You'll watch every step because this fault presentation, back pressure misread as valve fault, is one of the 3 most common misdiagnosed faults in this class of aircraft, and the next time it appears I need you to find it before we're working at midnight." Nam looked at her steadily for the first time since her arrival. Something in his face had shifted, the performance of indifference gone, replaced by the expression of someone who has decided, quietly and without announcement, to pay attention. Adisa said nothing, but he moved closer. They finished at 3:14 in the morning. The duct reformation had taken 90 minutes, careful, methodical, Ree's hands working the material with a precision that improved incrementally as the work progressed, as if the quality of the task was drawing out the quality of the technician. Sarah had called measurements every 4 minutes. He had adjusted. She had checked. He had adjusted again. The correction was clean when it was finished, well within tolerance, the deformation resolved without introducing new stress to the surrounding material. System test, pressure nominal. Bleed air flow, correct. Valve sensor, reading accurately for the first time since the 4-month service had introduced the duct damage and failed to document it. The pilot was notified at 3:21. He walked the system check himself, confirmed nominal, and authorized the aircraft for the scheduled departure. Guacwan's flight left on time. Sarah stood in the hangar as the ground support equipment was disconnected and the bay began its post-maintenance reset. Adisa was documenting the repair. She had asked him to write the full account, with measurements, with methodology, with the correct cause identification. He was writing carefully. Ree came to stand beside her. He stood there for a moment without speaking, in the way of a man who has decided to say something and is locating the right entry point. "The 4-month service," he said. "The duct damage occurred during my access to the fuel system. I didn't see it." "I know," she said. "I should have recorded the valve measurements regardless." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "The documentation standard you're implementing, the 3-reading requirement at each position." He paused. "It would have caught this." "It would have caught this 4 months ago," she said, "which is why it's the standard now." He nodded, the nod of a man not agreeing to be managed but agreeing with a correct thing. There was a difference, and she registered it because the difference mattered. She looked out across the hangar, at Adisa writing, at Nam coiling cable with the careful attention of someone who has decided that the small tasks also deserve to be done correctly, At the aircraft standing ready in the bay, fault resolved, system honest, ready to carry a dangerous man safely to wherever his business required him to go. A team that had been a collection of resistant individuals 6 hours ago had spent the night becoming something with a different shape. Not unified, not yet, but oriented, pointed for the first time in the same direction. She had not done it by asserting authority. She had done it the only way that produced a result that held, by knowing the answer, sharing the method, and making the work itself the argument for everything. But as she reached for her bag, her phone lit up. A message from an unknown number, 4 words and a document attachment. Check your employment terms. She opened the attachment. It was a legal filing. Harmon Precision Group versus parties unnamed, alleging unauthorized use of proprietary diagnostic methodology and theft of intellectual property. She read it twice. Then she looked up at the aircraft, running correctly, running honestly, every system telling the truth, and felt the cold, clean clarity of a woman who has kept every record, documented every method, and has been waiting without knowing she was waiting for exactly this moment. Because here is what the men who take your work without crediting it never calculate. The person they took it from was watching, was documenting, was filing, carefully and completely, everything they would one day need to prove that the work was always theirs. Harmon Precision just opened a case they built with her evidence. The legal filing had a title that ran to 43 words. Sarah had counted them on the night she received it, standing in the aircraft hangar with the smell of bleed air and hydraulic fluid still in her coat, reading a document that Harmon Precision Group's legal department had clearly been preparing for longer than the week since her departure. The language was dense and specific in the way that legal language gets specific when it is trying to make something that is not quite accurate sound precisely true, referencing proprietary diagnostic methodology and confidential technical frameworks and systematic appropriation of intellectual assets, with the kind of confident vocabulary that is designed to make the person it targets feel that the ground they are standing on is less solid than they believed. Sarah had read it twice. Then she had photographed every page. Then she had gone home, opened her calibration journal to the first entry, and begun building the response that Harmon's legal team had just made inevitable. The hearing was not a courtroom proceeding. It was, technically, a mediated technical arbitration, a process that both parties had agreed to in lieu of immediate litigation, on the recommendation of the arbitration panel that Guacwan's legal team had moved, with characteristic efficiency, to convene within 72 hours of the filing. The arbitration would determine whether the diagnostic methodologies claimed by Harmon as proprietary had originated within the firm or predated Sarah's employment there. If they predated it, the IP claim collapsed. If they didn't, the claim had standing, and the legal war extended into territory that would be expensive and slow for everyone involved. Harmon's legal team had agreed to arbitration because they believed they had the institutional record. 7 years of project reports, all filed under senior names, all existing within Harmon's document management system, all appearing, if you looked only at what was visible and did not ask about what was underneath, to show a consistent pattern of senior-led diagnostic innovation. They had not accounted for the journal. The arbitration venue was a conference center in the financial district, neutral ground, by agreement. The room assigned to the hearing was on the 14th floor, with windows that looked out over the city in the particular way that high rooms look out over things, as if perspective is a function of altitude rather than understanding. Sarah arrived 20 minutes early. She wore a charcoal suit she had bought the week before, not because she needed armor, but because the occasion required a specific kind of clarity, and she had learned that the external geometry of a person affects the quality of attention they receive before they have said a word. She carried the calibration journal in a document case, alongside a printed technical exhibit package that she and Guacwan's legal team had assembled over 4 days of 12-hour preparation sessions. The journal was the foundation. Everything else was architecture built on top of it. She sat at the respondent's table and arranged her materials with the same methodical precision she brought to a fault diagnosis. The journal centered, the exhibit packaged to its right, her notes to its left. She looked at the room, measured it the way she measured every room, what was fixed, what was movable, where the pressure points were. Harmon's legal team arrived 8 minutes later. 3 attorneys, 2 technical consultants, and Director Hewitt, who entered the room without looking at her initially, and then, when he had taken his seat directly across the table, looked at her once with the expression of a man who has been briefed to expect something difficult and is working out whether his briefing was adequate. Rourke was not present. She had wondered whether he would be. His absence told her something. Either Harmon's team had assessed him as a liability to their position, which was accurate, or he had declined to appear, which was also accurate to what she now understood about him. Guacwan's lead attorney, a compact, deliberate woman named Seoul who had reviewed the journal in 4 hours and called Sarah afterward to say, in a voice stripped of professional affect, "They have no idea what they filed against," took her seat to Sarah's left and opened her case without ceremony. The arbitrators entered, 3 of them, a retired appellate judge in the center, flanked by 2 technical specialists whose credentials in automotive diagnostic systems had been verified by both parties. The judge opened the session with the practiced brevity of someone who has run enough proceedings to know that preamble is where time goes to die. "We're here to determine origination of the diagnostic methodologies specified in the claimant's filing," she said. "Each party will present their technical evidence. The panel will ask questions. We proceed." Harmon's lead attorney stood. The claimant's case was structured around institutional record. 7 years of project reports, cross-referenced with Harmon's internal methodology database, presented in a sequence designed to establish a pattern. That the diagnostic framework Sarah had used throughout her tenure had been developed within Harmon's environment, using Harmon's resources, under Harmon's supervision, and therefore constituted Harmon's intellectual property regardless of who had generated the specific insights. It was, Sarah had to concede internally, a coherent argument on its surface. The surface was the problem. The surface was all they had. Their technical consultant, a forensic IP specialist who had been introduced with considerable credential, walked the panel through 6 case studies, each one showing a project report authored by a senior engineer and containing diagnostic methodology that the filing claimed as proprietary. The presentation was polished. The documentation was real. The argument was that the documentation proved origination. It proved filing. These were not the same thing. And Sarah had spent 4 days building the exhibit that demonstrated exactly why. CO did not interrupt. She made 2 notes. When Harmon's presentation concluded, the lead arbitrator looked at the respondent's table. "Ms. Kane, you'll present." Sarah stood. She had considered, across 4 days of preparation, various approaches to this moment. CO had recommended a primarily documentary approach. Let the journal speak, let the dates speak, keep Sarah's own voice minimal and controlled. It was sound legal strategy. Sarah had agreed to it in principle and modified it in practice, because the panel included 2 technical specialists, and technical specialists respond to technical argument delivered by technical people in the specific vocabulary of the discipline. They respond to it the way she responded to an engine, with the particular alertness of people hearing their own language spoken correctly. She would give them the documentary record, and she would explain what it meant in terms that made the explanation unnecessary. "The claimant's case rests on filing dates," she said. "I'd like to begin by establishing the difference between the date a methodology was filed and the date it was originated, because in this case, those dates are separated by between 2 and 4 years, and that separation is the entire argument." She opened the journal. "This is a calibration and diagnostic journal I have maintained since the beginning of my career. Handwritten. Undated entries confirmed by cross-reference to dated external records, service receipts, client correspondence, and internal Harmon communications that exist in both my personal archive and, I would submit, Harmon's own document management system, if their legal team chose to retrieve them. She turned to the first exhibit, the dual-source interference diagnostic framework that Harmon claims as proprietary, the methodology for identifying compound fault signals that mask each other's visibility, first appears in my journal on this date. She indicated the entry, 3 years and 4 months before the first Harmon project report in which it appears. The journal entry includes the theoretical basis, the measurement approach, and a worked example from a vehicle I serviced at that time. I have the service receipt for that vehicle. It is in your exhibit package, tab 3. One of the technical specialists leaned forward. The entry also references a technical paper I drafted on the methodology. That paper was submitted to Harmon's internal knowledge base under my name in draft form and subsequently published in the firm's technical bulletin under a senior engineer's name without my attribution. The draft submission exists in Harmon's document management system with my login credentials and my original timestamp. I did not delete it. Neither, it appears, did they. Silence from the claimant's table. The kind of silence that has a specific texture, the texture of people recalibrating. I'll walk the panel through each methodology claimed in the filing, Sarah said. For each one, I will show you the journal entry that predates the Harmon filing. I will show you the external record that corroborates the journal date. And I will explain, in technical terms, why the methodology reflects a diagnostic philosophy that I developed progressively across my career. A philosophy with a consistent internal logic that no institution generates, because institutions don't have philosophies. People do. She looked at the technical specialists. They were both writing. She began. She went through 7 methodologies in 90 minutes. Not quickly, with precision. Each one, the journal entry, the corroborating external record, the technical explanation of the methodology's internal logic, and its relationship to the entries before and after it in the journal's chronological sequence. She did not rush the technical explanations. She gave the panel the actual diagnostic reasoning, the why underneath the how, because the why was the thing that Harmon's filing could not account for. You can copy a methodology. You cannot retroactively construct the thinking that produced it, and the thinking was documented, in her handwriting, across 4 years of journal entries that formed a coherent intellectual progression no institution had supervised and no senior engineer had directed. The technical specialists asked questions. Good questions, the questions of people who understood the material well enough to probe its edges. She answered each one directly, without qualification, in the specific technical language of the discipline. She could feel, across the table, the quality of attention from Harmon's consultants changing. From the confident attention of people watching a presentation they expect to counter, to the different quality of people watching something they are no longer certain they can counter. Hewitt looked at his hands twice during the bleed air system methodology presentation. She noticed and registered it and continued. The third methodology, the thermal environment compensation she had applied to the Mulsanne sensor wire, the gauge selection that Flores had asked her about in the bay on her last day at Harmon, produced the sharpest exchange. Harmon's technical consultant interrupted. The thermal compensation factor in that methodology appears in a Harmon technical bulletin from 2 years ago. We're submitting it as exhibit. Tab 11 in your package, Sarah said. I've included the bulletin. I've also included the draft I submitted to Harmon's knowledge base 14 months before the bulletin's publication date, which contains the compensation formula in identical form. The draft exists in Harmon's system. The publication exists in Harmon's system. The 14-month gap between them exists in Harmon's system. She paused. If the panel wishes, I can also explain why the compensation factor is specifically sized the way it is, the mathematical basis for the coefficient. If the methodology originated at Harmon, their technical team should be able to provide the same explanation independently. The lead arbitrator looked at Harmon's table. Can you provide that derivation? A consultation, brief and from where Sarah sat, not productive. We'd need to. That would require additional time, too. Ms. Kane, the arbitrator said, the derivation. Sarah gave it. 3 minutes. Precise, complete, traceable from first principles to final coefficient, delivered in the tone of someone describing a route they have driven so many times they no longer need to think about the turns. One of the technical specialists set down his pen, picked it up again, made a mark that looked less like a note and more like a conclusion. The session broke for deliberation at 4:47 in the afternoon. Sarah sat in the corridor outside the hearing room with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and Seo beside her, who was reviewing notes in the focused silence of a person mentally rerunning a sequence to check for gaps. "The third methodology exchange," Seo said. "When you offered the derivation, was that planned?" "No," Sarah said. Seo looked at her. It was the turn of the entire hearing. "I know. You knew they couldn't provide it. If they had originated the methodology, they could have provided it without hesitation. The fact that they needed additional time to produce the derivation of their own claimed intellectual property is..." "The argument," Seo said. "Yes." She looked back at her notes. "You've done this before, not in a hearing, but this, presenting technical evidence to people who need to understand it before they can evaluate it." Sarah thought about the aircraft hangar at 3 in the morning, about Rhee's hands on the duct deformation, improving with each measurement call, about Addisa writing the complete repair documentation for the first time in his career at Harmon's facility. "Yes," she said, "I've done this before." The arbitrators returned in 40 minutes. The lead arbitrator delivered the panel's preliminary finding in the measured language of people who have reached a clear conclusion and are taking care with how they frame it. The documentary evidence presented by the respondent established, to the panel's satisfaction, that the diagnostic methodologies specified in the claimant's filing predated the respondent's employment at Harmon Precision Group in 4 of 7 cases, and predated the specific Harmon filings in all 7. The IP claim, as filed, lacked evidentiary foundation. The panel was prepared to recommend dismissal pending final review. Harmon's lead attorney requested a brief recess. Sarah looked at the window. The city from the 14th floor, the particular quality of late afternoon light that makes everything look, briefly, like it has found the position it was always meant to occupy. Her phone vibrated. A message from Guacwan's associate, a single line. "Mr. Guac sends his regards. He says, you kept good records." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she put her phone away and looked back at the room, at the table where her journal sat, at the exhibit package that had turned 7 years of stolen credit into a legal record that Harmon's team could not navigate around, at Hewitt across the table who was leaning close to his attorney, with the expression of a man being told something he had hoped not to hear. She did not feel triumph. Triumph was too loud for what she felt. She felt the quiet, specific satisfaction of a system finally telling the truth. The same satisfaction she felt when a fault was correctly identified and the engine ran clean. The work had always been hers. Now it said so in a room where saying so meant something. Because here is what 7 years of documentation produces that 7 years of silence never could, a record that speaks after you leave the room. Harmon built their case on what they had filed. Sarah built hers on what she had created. And creation, when it is documented with the precision of someone who always knew this day was possible, is not something a filing date can argue with. The IP claim is falling. Jerry Guac did not introduce himself as Guacwan's son. He introduced himself, on Sarah's 3rd day at the facility, as the logistics coordinator, the person responsible for scheduling, client liaison, and what he described, with a brevity that she later understood was characteristic, as the parts of the operation that aren't mechanical. He had come to her office with a scheduling conflict involving 2 vehicles and a delivery window, presented the problem in clear, specific terms, waited for her answer, and left when he had it. The interaction had taken 4 minutes. She had not thought much about him for the following 2 weeks. She had been thinking about bleed valves and legal filings and the measured reorientation of a 9-person team that had been pointed in the wrong direction for long enough that it had started to think the wrong direction was north. It was Addisa who mentioned it, in passing, during a parts inventory review. "Jerry's thorough," he had said, in the tone of someone noting something obvious. "He catches the things that fall between the technical side and the business side. His father trusts him with everything that isn't the mechanical." He had said it without emphasis, without the register that would have indicated he was telling her something significant. She had filed it, the way she filed everything, accurately and without immediate conclusion. Jerry came to her office on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the arbitration finding, with a document case and an expression she had not seen on him before. He was 29. He had his father's quality of stillness, the same capacity for taking up exactly the space he occupied, and no more. But where Guacwan's stillness had the density of authority accumulated over decades, Jerry's had a different texture. The stillness of someone who has learned, by proximity to power, that movement without purpose is its own kind of noise. He set the document case on her desk and sat in the chair across from her without being invited, which she registered as a change in register from their previous interactions. "I need your assessment of something," he said, "technically and operationally." "All right." He opened the case, set a bound proposal on her desk, 40 pages, she noted from the spine, produced with the quality of finish that indicates the people behind it expect it to be taken seriously. "Meridian Consolidated," he said, "Southeast Asian Infrastructure Consortium, 14 operating companies across 6 countries, combined fleet of approximately 300 ground vehicles and 11 aircraft. They're looking for a regional technical management partner, one organization to own maintenance standards, diagnostic protocols, and fleet compliance across the entire operation." He paused. "The contract term is 7 years. The value is significant. Their shortlist has 3 names on it." Sarah looked at the proposal, did not open it yet. "Who are the other 2?" she said. "A Singapore-based aviation services group with strong aircraft credentials and limited ground fleet experience, and Harman Precision Group." She looked up. Jerry held her gaze evenly. "Harman submitted their proposal 4 months ago, before the arbitration finding. Meridian is aware of the finding. They have not removed Harman from the shortlist, but their evaluation team has asked both remaining candidates to present a detailed technical capability review in person, in Singapore, in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" she said. "Not a month ago, not after the arbitration." "Because a month ago, I wasn't certain," he said, "about whether this operation had the technical depth to make a credible case for a contract of this scale. The arbitration established that the methodology is yours. The team's performance over the past 6 weeks has established that the methodology can be transferred." He paused. "And because the Meridian Evaluation Committee includes 2 people who will ask technical questions that require answers I cannot give, and Harman's current team cannot give correctly." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that require someone who understands both the diagnostic architecture and the operational logic of running a fleet at this scale across multiple regulatory environments." He looked at the proposal. "Meridian has had 2 significant fault recurrences in the past year, both grounded aircraft, both eventually traced to compound diagnostic failures that their current maintenance partners missed. They won't say this in the room, but it's in their recent operational reports and their contract requirements language, if you read it correctly." She pulled the proposal toward her and opened it. She read the requirements language on pages 4 through 7. Then she turned to the operational compliance section on pages 19 through 23. Then she read the technical evaluation criteria on page 31, which contained a specification that most readers would have processed as boilerplate, and which told her, with the clarity of an engine note she recognized, exactly what Meridian had experienced and exactly what they were actually looking for. She set the proposal down. "They had a bleed air system failure," she said. "Aircraft, probably in the past 8 months. Compound fault. The diagnostic read pointed to a primary system, and the underlying cause was in a secondary system that the primary fault was masking. Their current maintenance partner resolved the presenting symptom, and the underlying fault recurred." Jerry looked at her for a moment. Page 31 contains a technical specification. It doesn't reference a specific incident. No, she said, but the specification is written by someone who has been burned by a specific failure mode and is trying to write a requirement that prevents recurrence without disclosing the incident that generated the requirement. The language in Clause 4.3 is precise in a way that general specifications aren't. Someone wrote that clause from experience. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the incident was 9 months ago, a business jet in their Indonesian operation. The aircraft was grounded for 11 days. One of their senior executives was on board when the fault manifested. He paused. It was not publicly disclosed. Who told you that? My father has a wide network, he said, simply without elaboration. Sarah looked back at the proposal. At the requirements language she had just read, which she now understood not as a list of specifications, but as a document written by people who had been frightened by something and were trying to make sure it never happened again. She understood this kind of document. She had been writing versions of it her whole career, precise specifications born from specific failures that the specification was designed to prevent. She understood, also, what winning this contract would mean. Not personally. Structurally. A 7-year agreement with a 14-company consortium would establish the operation's technical credibility at a scale that made everything prior to it look like a preliminary. It would establish her methodology, her documented, arbitration-confirmed, intellectual property-vindicated methodology, as the operational standard for 300 vehicles and 11 aircraft across 6 countries. It would make the question of whether Sarah Kane was leadership material so obviously settled that the question itself would retire. She looked at Jerry. 3 weeks isn't long to build a presentation of this depth. No, he said, it isn't. I'll need the full operational data from our fleet, maintenance logs, fault recurrence rates, resolution timelines, everything since I took over, compared against the 6 months prior. I have it already compiled. She looked at him. You compiled our operational data before you came to this meeting. I compiled it 2 weeks ago, he said, when I decided I was going to bring this to you. A beat of quiet. She understood, in this moment, something about Jerry Guac that she had not fully assembled from the previous 6 weeks of 4-minute interactions and passing observations. He was not the logistics coordinator in the way that title implied, the person who managed the space between the technical and the business, because he lacked the depth for either. He managed that space because he understood both well enough to see what existed in the gap between them, and the gap was where most organizations lost the contracts that should have been theirs. He had been watching her work for 6 weeks. He had been building this case for 2 of them. He had come to her office on a Tuesday morning not to ask for her help, but to present her with a problem he had already half solved and to offer, in the document case, and the compiled data, and the 3 weeks he had quietly prepared for before walking through her door, his half of something that required both of them to complete. This was not deference. This was not the junior party presenting to the senior party. This was a different geometry, 2 people with different and complementary capabilities recognizing the shape of what they could build together that neither could build separately. She had not expected to find this here, in this operation, in this room. She pulled the proposal back toward her. Sit down properly, she said. We have work to do. They worked for 17 days. Not continuously. The facility didn't stop running because they had a presentation to build, and Sarah was not the kind of technical director who managed from a desk while her team managed the work. She ran the bays in the morning, reviewed the team's diagnostic logs in the early afternoon, and spent the late afternoon and evening hours in the operations office with Jerry, building the presentation layer by layer with the same methodical precision she brought to a fault diagnosis. Jerry worked the way she had come to expect from him, without waste. He did not produce material that needed to be substantially revised. He did not bring her half-formed ideas requiring her to complete them. He brought her complete components, the operational data structured exactly as she needed it to build the technical argument, the regulatory compliance matrix for all 6 countries organized by the specific criteria in Meridian's requirements language, the commercial terms framework that Guacwan's legal team had produced, and that Jerry had already reviewed for consistency with the technical commitments Sarah was proposing. On the 9th day, reviewing the section of the presentation that addressed Meridian's compound fault requirement, she showed him the dual-source interference methodology, not the legal version, the technical version. The actual diagnostic logic, walked through with a worked example from the Mulsanne repair. He followed it completely. Not as an engineer follows it. He did not have the hands-on intuition that came from years of physical diagnostic work, but as a person with genuine analytical intelligence follows a well-constructed logical sequence, tracking the reasoning, identifying the implications, understanding not just the what but the structural why. This is what Harmon couldn't provide in the arbitration, he said. The derivation. Yes. Because they never understood it. They only used it. You can use a methodology without understanding it, she said, up to the point where the situation requires you to adapt it. Then the gap between using and understanding becomes the fault. He looked at the worked example. The Meridian incident. Their maintenance partner used a standard diagnostic protocol and missed the compound signal because the protocol wasn't designed to look for mutual interference. Almost certainly. So the argument to Meridian isn't that our methodology is better in general. It's that our methodology was specifically built to find the class of fault that cost them 11 days and a frightened executive. She looked at him. Yes. He made a note. I'll restructure the executive summary around that framing. He did. She read it the following morning. It was better than what they had before, sharper in its specificity, more direct in its relevance to Meridian's actual experience, written in the language of people who understood what had happened to the consortium without announcing that they knew. On the 14th day, Ree knocked on the operations office door during an evening session. He held a tablet with the fault recurrence data from the past 6 weeks, the comparison period Sarah had requested. He had compiled it himself, he said, without being asked, because he thought the panel would want to see the methodology's application across the full range of vehicle types, not just the high-profile cases. The data showed a fault recurrence rate of 4% over 6 weeks. The previous 6-month period showed 31%. Sarah looked at the numbers for a long moment. Add your name to the data section, she said. You compiled it, it should say so. Ree looked at her. Something moved in his face, not surprise, exactly. The expression of a man receiving something he had stopped expecting to receive. He added his name. Singapore was warm in the way of cities that have decided warmth is simply the condition of existence rather than a seasonal event. The Meridian Consolidated offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building in the financial district that made a quiet argument about the scale of the organization's ambitions. The evaluation committee was 7 people, 4 operational executives, 2 technical specialists, and a risk officer whose specific presence told Sarah everything she needed to know about how seriously Meridian was treating the compound fault question. She and Jerry presented for 2 hours. She took the technical sections. He took the operational and commercial sections. They did not hand off, they transitioned, the way 2 people transition when they have spent 14 days building something together and understand not just their own part, but the connective tissue between the parts. The evaluation committee asked 41 questions. She counted them without meaning to. The risk officer asked the question that mattered most, 40 minutes in the careful language of someone who has been told to ask it without revealing what generated it. Can you describe a scenario in which your diagnostic methodology identified a fault that conventional diagnostic software failed to flag? Sarah described the Mulsanne, 17 minutes, dual-source interference, the mutual masking of 2 compound signals. She described it in technical terms precise enough to satisfy the specialists and in consequential terms clear enough to satisfy the executives. She described it without drama, without performance, in the even voice of someone describing a true thing. The risk officer wrote for 45 seconds after she finished. Then he looked up and asked, "Is this methodology documented?" "Comprehensively," she said. "It has been since the beginning of my career." He wrote again. The second technical specialist, who had said very little for the first 90 minutes, which Sarah had registered as the behavior of someone who was listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak, asked the final question of the session. "The operational data you've presented shows a 27-point reduction in fault recurrence over a 6-week period. What produced that reduction?" Sarah looked at the data slide, thought about Rhee's hands on the duct deformation at 3 a.m, about Adisa writing the complete repair record, about Nam putting his phone away. A team that was taught the difference between resolving a symptom and identifying a cause, she said, and a documentation standard that made the difference between those two things visible. The specialist looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the quality of a person closing a question they have fully answered. The committee broke for deliberation at 3:47. Sarah and Jerry waited in a glass-walled anteroom with water neither of them drank. Jerry sat with his hands on the table, looking at the middle distance in the focused, interior way of someone running the session back through their own assessment. Sarah looked at the city through the glass, its scale, its precision, its complete indifference to the meeting happening on the floor above it. "The risk officer," Jerry said. "When you described the Mulsanne repair, he stopped writing and just listened." "I know." "That's when it shifted." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been the most capable person in every room for a long time." She looked at him. "I'm not saying it as a compliment," he said. "I'm saying it as a structural observation. It produces a specific kind of patience in a person, the kind that looks like stillness from the outside but is actually compressed." She held his gaze. "Is there a question in that?" "No," he said, "just an accurate thing." The committee returned in 51 minutes. The chair, a woman who had said very little during the presentation and whose quality of attention had told Sarah she was the actual decision-maker in the room, spoke for 3 minutes. Her language was precise, and her conclusion was unambiguous. Meridian Consolidated would be moving forward with a partnership agreement. The term would be 7 years. The formal contract would follow within 30 days. They looked forward to a productive relationship. She looked at Sarah when she said it, not at Jerry, not at the room. At Sarah. Because this is what power looks like when it has been built correctly, not announced, not performed, not granted by the people who withheld it for as long as they could. It looks like a committee chair making eye contact with the person in the room whose capability has made the decision obvious. It looks like a 7-year contract and a risk officer who stopped writing and just listened. It looks like the moment when the work you have always done in other people's names finally stands in a room under yours. Sarah Kane flew home with a signed letter of intent and a team that had produced the data that made it possible. The sign went up on a Wednesday morning. Not ceremonially, there was no scheduled unveiling, no gathered audience, no moment engineered for documentation. The installation team arrived at 7, worked for 40 minutes, and left. Sarah was in the aircraft hangar running a pre-flight systems check on the Gulfstream when Adisa appeared at the hangar door and said, with the specific quality of understatement that had become characteristic of him over the past year, "It's up." She finished the systems check, signed the log, handed it to T1, who had become, over 14 months of consistent and demanding work, the most methodically precise technician in the facility, the kind of person whose documentation you didn't need to verify because his standard of verification exceeded yours. Then she walked out to the forecourt. Guac Engineering. The letters were clean and substantial against the building's facade, not oversized, not performing confidence, simply present in the way of things that belong where they are. Beneath the name in smaller text, technical direction, fleet management, diagnostic systems. She stood in the forecourt and looked at it for a long time. Not with the feeling she had expected. She had expected something louder, the emotional equivalent of an engine catching after a long fault diagnosis, the sharp resolution of something that had been running wrong finally running right. What she felt instead was quieter and more structural. The feeling of a load-bearing element settling into its correct position. Not dramatic, permanent. She had been waiting for this her whole career. The strange thing about Arrival, she was discovering, was that it didn't feel like Arrival. It felt like the place you had always been standing, finally named correctly. The wedding was Jerry's idea. Not the marriage that had developed with the same organic logic as everything between them. The recognition of two people whose capabilities complemented each other so precisely that proximity had eventually made the personal conclusion as obvious as the professional one. But the wedding itself, the timing of it, the decision to hold it at the facility rather than a conventional venue, that had been Jerry. Here, he had said, 3 months before, standing in the vehicle bay that had been the site of Sarah's first full team training session, the night she had walked Ree through the duct deformation repair. This is where it started, not the personal part, the real part, the part that made everything else possible. She had looked at him for a moment. The real part. The part where the work became something larger than one person doing it, he said. That's worth marking in the place where it happened. She had not argued. Jerry was, she had learned across 14 months of close professional and personal proximity, correct with a frequency that made arguing with him an inefficient use of time. Not because he deferred to expertise he didn't possess. He had the specific intelligence of someone who understood systems and organizations, and the human architecture of both, with a clarity that she found genuinely rare. He was correct because he thought carefully and spoke only when the thinking was complete. She had spent 7 years in rooms full of men who spoke before the thinking was complete. The contrast had, initially, been disorienting. The facility on the morning of the wedding had a quality she had not anticipated. It looked like itself. She had expected transformation, the decorative apparatus of ceremony imposing a different identity on the space. What Jerry had arranged instead was the facility made more fully itself. The vehicle bays were clean with the specific cleanliness of people who cared about the space, rather than people who had prepared it for an audience. The aircraft hangar, where the ceremony would be held, had been arranged with chairs and lighting that acknowledged the scale of the space rather than trying to domesticate it. The Gulfstream sat at the far end of the hangar, visible, present, not hidden because guests were arriving. It belonged there. Everything in the space belonged there. Ree had washed every vehicle in the facility the previous afternoon. She had not asked him to. He had done it with Nam and Adisa, and 2 of the newer technicians she had recruited from Harmon's overlooked junior pool, people whose capabilities she had recognized from the other side of the bay over years of watching good work get attributed to the wrong names. When she had passed the vehicle bay at 4 in the afternoon and seen them working, she had not said anything. She had noted it in the specific register she kept for things that mattered. She dressed in the operations office. A mirror had been installed, temporarily, at her request, because she did not need it to persist. A colleague from the Meridian partnership had sent flowers that smelled like the Singapore office anteroom and made her smile at the specific texture of the memory. Her calibration journal sat on the desk where it always sat, because she had not moved it, because it belonged there, and today was not a day for things to be somewhere other than where they belonged. She looked at herself in the mirror with the same quality of attention she brought to a pre-work assessment, not vanity, inventory. She wore ivory, structured at the shoulder, because she was a person who needed a garment to have architecture. Her hair was in the sleek bun she had worn in the bay on the day of the Mulsanne. She had chosen this deliberately. That day had been the hinge of everything. It deserved acknowledgement. She picked up the journal, held it for a moment, set it down. She didn't need it today. Everything it contained was already built into the structure of what surrounded her. The guests were 83 people. Not a large wedding by the standards of events designed to perform scale, but every person in the hangar had a specific and non-decorative relationship to what was being marked. Guacwan sat in the front row in a dark suit with his characteristic stillness. The stillness that had, over 14 months, revealed itself to be not coldness, but precision. The stillness of a man who had learned that the most useful thing you can do in most rooms is observe accurately. He had given her the first room that had valued what she brought to it. She had not forgotten this and did not intend to. The Meridian risk officer was there. She had not expected this, and had felt something genuine and unguarded when she saw him, because his presence meant that the contract was not purely transactional, that something in the Singapore presentation had registered beyond the professional. He sat with two members of the Meridian Technical Evaluation Committee, people who had become, across 14 months of operational partnership, the kind of professional relationship that occasionally crosses the line into something warmer without losing its precision. Flores was there. She had invited him specifically because he had asked the real question in the bay on her last day at Harmon, the question about the gauge selection, and because he had said "I'm sorry" without using it to absolve himself, and because he had. In the months since, sent her 2 technical papers he had written independently that were genuinely good. She had written back about both of them. The correspondence had continued. Rourke was not there. She had not invited him and did not examine the decision closely. Some reckonings resolve in tribunals and some resolve in the silence of an unopened invitation. Both are valid resolutions. Rhee sat in the 3rd row with Addisa on his left and T1 on his right and Nam at the end, and the 4 of them had the seated posture of people who belong to something and know it. She looked at them when she entered the hangar and felt the specific weight of what a team means when it has been built correctly. Not assembled, built, with the same attention to the relationship between components that a sound mechanical repair requires. Each part in its correct position, each connection genuine, the whole capable of things the individual parts could not produce separately. The ceremony was conducted by a civil celebrant who had been briefed to keep it honest, and was doing so with evident satisfaction. Jerry stood at the front of the hangar in a dark suit that had the same quality as everything Jerry produced, correct, without announcing its correctness. He looked at her when she walked in with the focused attention she had come to recognize as his specific form of emotional expression, the full application of his considerable powers of observation to the thing he valued most. She walked without accompaniment. She had considered this carefully and concluded that walking alone was the accurate choice, not as a statement, as a fact. She had arrived at every significant moment in her career alone, under her own propulsion, without the institutional support or the professional sponsorship that would have made the journey shorter and less expensive. Walking alone today was not a performance of independence. It was continuity. The celebrant spoke briefly and well about the particular kind of partnership that is built on the recognition of genuine complementarity, not similarity, not completion of what the other person lacks, but the recognition of 2 different and fully realized capabilities that produce something in combination that neither produces alone. She had spoken to both of them in preparation and had clearly listened more than she had talked. Jerry's vows were precise and unsentimental in the way of honest things. He said that he had known she was the right person for the technical director role before she had fixed the Mulsanne, because he had watched her across the bay for 47 minutes and seen the specific quality of a person who knows the answer and is managing the cost of not yet being permitted to give it. He said that watching that quality across 47 minutes had taught him more about patience and precision and the dignity of withheld capability than anything else he had witnessed in his professional life. He said that he wanted to spend the rest of his life building things that were worthy of that quality. She had not expected the specificity. She had not expected the 47 minutes. She stood with her hands still, the promise she had made to herself in the fishbowl, honored again, in a different room, for a different reason, and felt something that was not the compressed, quiet endurance of the previous 7 years, and was not the loud resolution she had expected arrival to feel like. It was simpler than either. It was the feeling of being accurately seen by someone who had the capacity to see accurately and had chosen to look. Her own vows were technical in the way that honest things are technical when they come from a person who thinks in systems and structures and the logic of how things connect. She said that a good partnership, like a sound repair, requires that both components understand not just their own function, but the function of the other, that you cannot build something that holds under load if you don't know what load the other element is carrying. She said that she had spent 7 years in rooms that required her to carry the load invisibly, and that the first thing Jerry had given her, before the contract and before the title and before the name on the building, was the experience of having the weight accurately assessed by someone who then helped design a structure capable of bearing it. She said that she intended to build things with him that would outlast both of them. Guacwan, in the front row, made no visible expression, but she saw his hands move, a single, small adjustment of his right hand in his lap, the gesture of a man containing something he has decided not to perform for the room. She noted it, filed it accurately. The reception had the quality of the facility itself, functional and warm in the specific way of spaces that are used for real work by people who respect the work. Tables in the vehicle bay. The Mulsanne parked at the far end, clean to a standard that Ree had clearly supervised personally, its engine quiet and resolved under its hood. She stood beside it for a moment during the reception, one hand resting lightly on the roof, and thought about the first time she had heard its engine note from across a bay and known, within 40 seconds, what was wrong with it. About the 47 minutes of waiting. About the 11 steps across polished concrete. About 6 words that had cost everything she'd had left to spend and had returned, with compound interest, everything she had built in the years since. If you permit, I will fix it. She had not been asking permission. She had been, she understood now, announcing intention in the only language the room was capable of hearing. The permission had been a formality. The fixing had always been inevitable. The only question had been when the room would stop preventing it. She looked at the sign visible through the hangar's open doors. Guac Engineering. The afternoon light landing on the letters with the even, indifferent generosity that light extends to everything. The sign that deserved it, and the building that housed the work that had earned it. Addisa appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses and the expression of someone who has prepared a speech and is deciding whether the moment warrants it. He handed her a glass, decided against the speech, raised his own glass instead, briefly, in the gesture that means everything it means without requiring words. She raised hers. Ree, across the bay, caught the movement and raised his. T1, Nam, the newer technicians, who understood the gesture from context and made it their own. Floris, who had come from across the room at exactly the right moment with the instinct of someone who was learning to read rooms correctly. Guacwan, who raised nothing, but whose gaze met hers across the bay with the direct, unmediated quality of a man acknowledging a fact. Jerry came to stand beside her. He looked at the sign. She looked at the sign. It holds, he said. She knew he meant the structure, the whole architecture of what they had built, the team and the contract and the legal record and the name above the door and the methodology that now ran 300 vehicles and 11 aircraft across 6 countries under the authorship it had always deserved. It holds, she said. And then, from the entrance of the vehicle bay, movement. A figure she had not invited and had not expected, standing at the threshold with the uncertain posture of someone who has arrived at a place they are not certain they have the right to enter. Director Hewitt. Older than she remembered, which was strange because it had been 14 months, not 14 years. He was not in his suit. He wore a jacket she did not recognize and held nothing, no clipboard, no document case, no institutional prop of any kind. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the bay, and then at the sign visible through the open doors, and then, finally, at her. She held his gaze across the width of the vehicle bay. The room did not stop. The reception continued around them, conversation, the sound of Addisa laughing at something T1 had said, the particular warmth of 83 people occupying a space correctly. Life moving forward in the way it moves when the structure beneath it is sound. Hewitt did not move from the threshold. He was waiting, she understood, for something she had not yet decided whether to give. She looked at him for a long moment, with the same quality of attention she had given the Mulsanne's engine on the day everything changed, reading what was actually there rather than what she had been told to expect. Then she looked at Jerry. He had seen Hewitt. He was watching her, not Hewitt, because Jerry understood, with the accuracy that had made him the right person to build this with, that the decision belonged to her, and that his role in this moment was to be present without being directive. She looked back at Hewitt. And she made the decision that only a person who has already one can afford to make, not from weakness, not from the need to resolve anything, but from the particular freedom of someone who no longer requires anything from the person standing at the door. She gave a single nod, brief, unambiguous. Come in. Not because he deserved it, because she had built something large enough that the cost of the gesture was negligible, and because the person who could afford generosity toward the people who had once withheld everything was the person who had built everything they had withheld from her into something those people could not have imagined. Hewitt stepped inside. The bay continued. The sign held its position above the door. Guacwan Engineering. Truth, skill, heart. All three present, finally, in a room that had been built for exactly this, by a woman who had counted 11 steps across a polished floor and taken every one of them on her own, carrying the weight of 7 years of invisible work and the absolute certainty that the engine would tell the truth when someone finally asked it the right question in the right language. It had. She had. And the name above the door said so, in letters that did not require anyone's permission to stand. Have you ever been the most qualified person in the room and still been told to wait? Type, "I'm ready" in the comments right now. And if Sarah's story moved something in you, share it with one person who needs to hear it today. Because the world is full of Sarah Kanes who are still counting their steps across the floor, still waiting for the silence that makes space for their voice.